Growing up with baby boomers as parents really made me appreciate the culture of the 60s, especially the music and people. My dad always had the radio tuned to 106.9 The Fox, the classic hit station. My personal favorite band growing up was the Beatles. Their style of music was original and catchy. John Lennon was my favorite Beatle because though his lyrics were imaginative and illogical at times, they usually had a deeper poetic meaning. John Lennon did not have a very normal upbringing. He was born October 9, 1940 in Liverpool, England, to Alfred and Julia Lennon. Alfred was a merchant seaman and was often absent during John's childhood. According to Ben Urish and Ken Bellin, authors of The Words and Music of John Lennon, Julia slipped out of the house many nights after John fell asleep, leaving him unattended while she went dancing and drinking. At a very young age, John understood the feeling of being abandoned and unloved, shaping the relationships for the rest of his life. In his book, The Lives of John Lennon, Albert Goldman claims John's Aunt Mimi gained custody when he was 4 years old, telling Julia, "You are not fit to be this boy's mother." John's aunt and Uncle George raised him, but he still visited his mother regularly. Mimi was strict, but she gave him the best upbringing he could have asked for. She had high standards for him and wanted him to be a proper, well-educated boy. John's Uncle George was a much more carefree and loving individual. He and John had an unconditional love that is usually found only between father and son. In his book, John Lennon, The Life, Philip Norman claims that John's uncle was present a lot in John's childhood and encouraged his creativity in subjects such as art, while also teaching him how to read and write. John's love for music was developed in his childhood with the encouragement of his mother and uncle. John's visits with his mom spurred his love for music, listening to Elvis records and playing the banjo together. His uncle also played music from the big radio phonograph in the lounge. According to Goldman, Mimi did not support it when John's mother bought him his first guitar in 1956. According to Norman, as Mimi was skeptical of his claims that he would become famous one day, she hoped he would grow bored with music, often telling him, "The guitar's all very well, John, but you'll never make a living out of it." When John was 16, he formed the band The Quarrymen, which consisted of him and some high school friends. Different band members came and went, but in 1960, The Quarrymen turned into the Beatles, consisting of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Stuart Sutcliffe. A few months later, they were in need of a drummer, so they quickly hired Pete Best. McCartney took over on bass after Sutcliffe decided to quit, and soon after, Ringo Starr replaced Pete Best on drums. This was the lineup that carried the Beatles through their height in the 60s. According to Norman, the Beatles quickly reached stardom in the UK, and after their February 1964 debut on The Ed Sullivan Show, Beatlemania spread across the globe. Their appearance consisted of long hair and usually suits when on stage. They were truly performers, making the audience go wild with the energy they put off from the stage. The Beatles changed management several times during their time together, and at one point Paul even took on the role as manager. The Beatles released 21 albums over the course of 7 years and had countless hits all across the world. However, in the late 60s, tension began to build among group members. Paul called John one day in September 1969 and informed him that he was leaving the Beatles, and the band dissolved after that. However, legal disputes lasted for years, and the end of the partnership did not take effect until January 1975. While the Beatles were on tour, John was introduced to Preludin, a stimulant drug of the morpholin chemical class that was used as an appetite suppressant, and began taking it regularly, along with amphetamines to stay awake during their long overnight performances. In January of 1966, John was unknowingly introduced to LSD when his dentist at a dinner party spiked his drink. After that first experience with LSD, he started using it regularly. Under the influence of LSD, John wrote the hit Strawberry Fields from the album Sgt. Pepper. This song is about John's sense of irreality. According to Goldman, John claimed that you can never tell what is real, so there is no point in trying. That entire album makes one feel like they have entered a state of hallucinogenic delusions. It was a hit. This hallucinogenic stimulated him to make amazing music, but taking it so often and for such a long period of time caused him to lose touch with reality. Also, while John and Yoko Ono were together, they became addicted to heroin. He also experimented with other drugs such as cocaine, methadone, Thai stick, magic mushrooms, and a variety of unidentified pills. There is no doubt that taking all these drugs for such a long period of time had a huge impact on John's physical as well as emotional health. John had always felt threatened by Paul's musical talent, and according to Goldman, when John became addicted to drugs, Paul seemed to take over the leadership position in the band. John felt Paul's new leadership role came off as bossy at times, but did not verbalize his concerns and let his feelings build up. According to Norman, the two of them came up with most of the Beatles' lyrics and music together, though John always saw himself as an original artist and Paul just looking for commercial success. Their rivalry could be considered one of the causes of the band's breakup. John and Paul ended on a bitter note, and both wrote unflattering songs about the other in their solo albums.
Anyway, she didn't split the Beatles, because how could one girl split the Beatles, or one woman, you know? The Beatles were drifting apart on their own, you know.
Can you remember when you realized that it was inevitable that you would split up?
Well, no. No. It's like saying, you know, did you remember falling in love? Not quite, you know. It just sort of happens.
Critics and close friends have also pointed to Lennon's relationship with Yoko Ono as another contributing factor to the breakup of the Beatles. John met Yoko Ono on November 9, 1966 at her art exhibition at the Indica Gallery. Sharing a common love for music and the arts, they fell in love and were married on March 20, 1969, soon after his divorce with his first wife, Cynthia. According to Norman, John's creative focus began to move beyond the Beatles, and he and Yoko recorded 3 albums of experimental music together. During their time together, John turned his back on the Beatles, and he and Yoko formed the Plastic Ono Band. In 1969, the Plastic Ono Band released the single Give Peace a Chance, which was adopted as the anthem for the anti-war movement, according to Norman. In 1973, John and Yoko decided to separate. During this period, he began drinking heavily and made headlines with his drunken incidents. Goldman quotes May Pang, John's lover during his and Yoko's separation, saying John's departure from the Beatles had essentially been Yoko's idea. After 18 months of being separated, John and Yoko got back together, and Yoko gave birth to John's second son, Sean Lennon, on October 9, 1975. John stayed home to take on the role of house husband, devoting all of his time to raising Sean. In 1971, John released the album Imagine, and its title track became another anthem for the anti-war movement. According to Goldman, this album was the most commercially successful of John's post-Beatle work. His album Mind Games was released in 1973 and did not receive good reviews. However, in 1974, John's album Walls and Bridges was released and quickly went to #1 on the charts. John took a break from music when his son was born in 1975. He returned to music in October 1980 and released his last album, Double Fantasy, which reflected his contentment in his new stable life, according to Norman. Unfortunately, he was not able to enjoy his newfound stability for long. On December 8, 1980, John Lennon's life tragically ended, silencing one of the greatest lyricists of a generation. Mark David Chapman was a huge Beatles fan growing up and felt that John betrayed the ideals of the Beatles by being rich and having large houses. Chapman was a deeply disturbed individual who claimed there were voices in his head telling him to kill John Lennon. At about 4 p.m. on December 8, 1980, while John was getting into a car, Mark David Chapman appeared and asked John for an autograph. At around 10:50 p.m., John and Yoko returned to their New York apartment to find a shady figure standing outside. Chapman walked towards John, softly called Mr. Lennon, pulled out a handgun, and fired 5 shots. John was quickly rushed to the emergency room but was pronounced dead upon arrival at 11:07 p.m. On this December night, the world lost a genius of the spirit, according to Yoko Ono in her book Memories of John Lennon. John Lennon will always be remembered as an amazing songwriter, full of energy, heart, and soul. He was not only a world-famous musician, but a man who cared deeply about the world and the people who lived in it. Many were inspired by John Lennon to pursue their dreams without the fear of someone telling them they can't. It is unfortunate that the life of this creative soul was cut short because he has so much more to offer to the
If you
world.
had one wish for Christmas time, what would it be?
Peace
Peace on earth. Yeah.
and love.
Peace on earth. That implies no violence, no starving children, no violent minds, no violent households, no violence,
frustration.
no frustration, no fear.
Nothing you can say that can't be done. Nothing you can say, but you can learn how to play the game.